So welcome everyone to PoetryEast. Here I am at the London Buddhist Centre. My name is Maitreyabandhu, and I've got the real pleasure of interviewing Alexander McCall Smith, he's written over 100 books, something like 60 plus novels and 40 children's books. He's also just published his first collection of poetry. He's written a book on Auden. I'm really delighted to be able to interview Alexander. Alexander's had his novels published in 46 languages, a remarkable feat in itself, and he's sold over 30 million copies, which something any writer would be envious of. He's also won the CBE for services to literature, and he was honoured by the President of Botswana for services through literature. So today I want to talk to him particularly about In a Time of Distance, which is his first collection of poetry. But I also want to talk about this short book on Auden called What W.H. Auden Can Do For You, which was the first thing I read of Alexander's. And it's by far the best short book on Auden that I've ever read. So welcome, Alexander. Really good to have you here at PoetryEast. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Maitreyabandhu. Thank you.
Very nice to see you. So we're premiering this, as you know, on Christmas Eve. I somehow thought you were just the right guest to premiere on Christmas Eve. So you're the person I'd like to spend Christmas Eve with. I thought it'd just be nice to hear what you're going to be doing. It's a bit personal, but what are you going to be doing for Christmas? And just to get a sense of what your Christmas is looking like.
Well, we'll be spending Christmas in our house in Edinburgh, which is where I'm talking to you from, and we are very fortunate in being able to have that with family. We have two daughters, both of whom are married with two children each, and so we'll have the children around us, which of course is always wonderful at Christmas, because they're of an age, they go from 6 downwards to 2, and so they're of an age to really be very excited about Christmas. So we'll spend that here in Edinburgh, where I am now, and then New Year we go to Argyll. We have a house in Argyll in a very remote place, and I find that period round about New Year a very important one for thinking about things. I think I find it quite an interesting time. It's a relatively quiet time, oddly enough, in Scotland, where New Year is a very big celebration. But the days after New Year, I find, are a very valuable and important time for reflection.
And is that because it's like the dark time of year or the turning of the year?
Well, it is that. I mean, I must say that I always look forward to the 21st of December as being the time when the days begin to get longer. So I feel a bit more optimistic when we reach the 21st of December. But there's something about those first few days of January. You're aware of the fact that this is a new year that you're embarking upon, and the rather frenzied feel of December, because December has become a terribly busy month for many people. That frenzied feel is behind you, and I think it's a time of contemplation, really, about what's going to happen over the following year, and I think we all need that sort of time. It's the middle of winter, and there's a stillness about winter, particularly in those latitudes. When we're in Argyll, we're at 56 degrees, actually slightly more north. So we're very far north. It's quiet, and the days are very short. We're right on the edge of a sea loch, and there are geese on the salt marsh, and it's very atmospheric in a way, very quiet. So it's a good time. It's a good time to be there.
Sounds beautiful. I must say, I'm rather envious. I'm going to be on retreat at Christmas, so it's a quiet time as well. But not quite in that sort of beauty.
Interestingly enough, actually, I at the beginning of the lockdown that we've been through, right at the beginning of that, back in March 2020, that this all started, I happened to be reading two books about monasticism. I was reading Patrick Leigh Fermore's book, The Time to Keep Silence, and I was also reading a book on contemporary monasticism by a Benedictine abbot. And just coincidentally, both of these books talk about silence and the importance of a period of silence and reflection in our lives. And the book by the Benedictine was very interesting because he talked about how there was far too much busyness in our lives, and we were all rushing around being far too busy. And then lo and behold, as I was reading those books, the world shut down. In a sense, underlining the point that they were making.
Indeed. Well, that's a really good way of introducing your poems, isn't it? Because the first poem I've been cheeky enough to sort of request you to read particular poems rather than allow you to choose them yourself. But I thought that's a really good way of hearing that poem in a time of distance, which is the title poem of your very recently published collection. So let's plunge straight into that, and we'll talk about that, Alexander.
Yes, sure. Yes, this is the book in question, In a Time of Distance, with a lovely illustration there by my old friend and illustrator Ian McIntosh, and it shows a croft house with a washing line in front of it in the west of Scotland, and you'll see that there's a man's suit which is hanging there on the line, and that's something which I saw years ago when I was travelling in that part of Scotland. I went past this croft, and there was this black man's suit, just had been washed and was hanging on a line. Of course, dry cleaners were no dry cleaners for 100 miles or whatever, and so they had to do that. And that's an image that stayed with me, and so that appears in one of the poems. But the title of this book, In a Time of Distance, is taken from one of the poems, which is one I wrote for the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, and it was broadcast on that programme. And that was at a time when we were all very isolated because of circumstances. So it's the poem which was my response to those particular circumstances. In a time of distance, the unexpected always happens in the way the unexpected has always occurred, while we're doing something else, while we're thinking of altogether different things, matters that events then show to be every bit as unimportant as our human concerns so often are. And then, with the unexpected upon us, we look at one another with a sort of surprise. How could things possibly turn out this way when we're so competent, so pleased with the elaborate systems we've created, with the networks and satellites, intelligent machines, pills for every eventuality except this one. And so we turn again to face one another and discover those things we had almost forgotten, but that mercifully are still there. Love and friendship, not just for those to whom we are closest, but also for those whom we do not know, and of whom perhaps we have in the past been frightened. The words brother and sister, powerful still, are brought out, dusted down, found to be still capable of expressing what we feel for others, that precise concern, joined together in adversity, we discover things we had put aside, old board games with obscure rules, books we had been meaning to read, letters we had intended to write, things we had thought we might say, but for which we never found the time. And from these discoveries of self, of time, there comes a new realization that we have been in too much of a hurry, that we've misused our fragile world, that we have forgotten the claims of others who have been left behind. We find that out in our seclusion, in our silence. We commit ourselves afresh. We look for a few bars of a song that we used to sing together a long time ago. We give what we can, we wait, knowing that when this is over, a lot of us, not all perhaps, but most, will be slightly different people, and our world, though diminished, will be a much bigger, its beauty revealed afresh.
Thank you.
A time of distance.
Yeah, in a time of distance. Of course, the first question I wanted to ask you from that is, do you feel that you've come out a slightly different person? And what would that be? What does that feel like for you?
Well, I think probably most of us have been changed by the experience of the last 18 months, 2 years. I think most of us have realised certain things about ourselves and about our world. One would have to be, I suppose, very detached from things not to realise that conditions had changed in the world about us. So that I think is an experience that just about everybody has had, and I've certainly had that. I, like everybody else, have had to ask myself questions about the life I was leading. I was, prior to all this happening, I think I was leading far too busy a life. I was away too much. I was touring a lot with the books. Okay. So I spent 3 or 4 months of the year on tour, staying in hotels and being in airports. And, that was no existence at all. And, of course, that sort of life is unsustainable anyway. I think that's something that we really have come to realise, that we can't go on abusing our world as we've been doing. So for me, there was that a good deal of thought that had to be thought, so to speak, around those things. I think most of us probably feel that we have changed a bit. Whether we'll go back to our bad old ways, I don't know. I think we will to an extent, because all of us do go back to our bad old ways given half the chance. But I think there will be change. Another thing which I think has happened in this period, and it's something which I think certainly is something that yourself and your colleagues who practice and are interested in Buddhism will be particularly interested in. That, I think, is that we are questioning our materialism.
Yes,
I think that is something that people really have had quite a hard think about. The insane materialism of our world has been brought up sharp, I think.
Yes, I wanted to talk later on in a conversation. I want to come back to this question of materialism, because you've written very eloquently about that in your book on Auden, for instance, and I'll come back onto that. But
sure. Before
we do that, I thought there's a lovely moment at the end of Number 1 Ladies Detective Agency where someone says a mechanic cannot become a poet. One of your beautiful characters says a mechanic cannot become a poet. So I wanted to know how a professor of medical law has come to write, over 100 books and a new volume of poetry. How has that happened to you, Alexander?
Well, I actually always wanted to be a writer. I think if you asked most writers when they started, when they first knew that they wanted to be writers, I think a lot of them will say, from the age of 6 or whatever. So I always wanted to write, and always did as a child. I think most children love writing little stories. I sent my first manuscript off when I was 8. It was, and in fact, I got a letter back from the publisher, which was a wonderful thing to, a very kind publisher wrote back and said, "Thank you very much, we can't do this." It was a 1-page story, probably written in pencil, that I sent off. So I'd always wanted to do that, and I was so I wrote all the way through. Writers, of course, though, need to have a day job, so to speak. They usually have to do something other than write, I mean, there are some who earn their living in that way right from the very word go, but they're the exception. And indeed, it's no bad thing, I think, for a writer to do something quite different and to write in his or her spare time in the background, because in that way you get some experience of the world, and you see things which are connected with the job that you're doing, and you meet people and so on. So general life experience comes through that. In my case, I wrote in my spare time all the way through my career. I was doing something quite different during the day, but in my spare time I was writing, and a lot of people are in that position. They've had other jobs, but they've written in the background.
Indeed. And what about, you're very, very well known for the novels, but what about poetry? That does seem to be a love of yours. Certainly I know that we'll come on to your love of Auden in a bit, but when did sort of poetry itself enter, both reading it and writing it?
Well, I've been a great devotee of poetry, I think, probably all my life. I remember as a little boy, I read a lot of poetry because I had a wonderful set of books which I got when I think I was about 8 or 9, Arthur Mee's Children's Encyclopedia. And Arthur Mee published this extraordinary 20 volumes, I think it was about 20 volumes, set of encyclopedias for children. It was, I think, published in parts and then all came together in the big thing. And I had that, and it was a really rather oddly organized encyclopedia. It moved from steamships to great rivers of the world and all the usual stuff without much system. But interspersed in all that were poems, and there were all sorts of poems, usually narrative poems of the sort that children would like. So poems of stirring deeds that boys would like, and various other things. And so you had the usual thing, Tennyson and Wordsworth and whatnot. And so I read those when I was a boy, and then I was also I had poetry as part of my school education, and was required to learn 10 or 15 lines of poetry a day. And that actually really was quite good, not only, I suspect, from the point of view of developing a rote memory, which would be useful in other things, but also for inculcating the rhythms of language and of poetry. So poetry was there. And then in my adult life, I became very interested in, initially in my early 20s, I took a serious interest in Scots poetry. And so I've got quite a large collection of books by Scottish poets. I was influenced by the Scottish poetic renaissance of the 1950s onwards, really, people like MacDiarmid and others, and we had a really wonderful collection of Scottish poets writing in that period, in the early part of the second half of the 20th century, and I collected books by those people and was fairly involved in it. And then I started to write it a little bit myself. I had 1 or 2 poems published when I was in my 20s in the journals, but not very much, and didn't thereafter do much about that until much later on, when I began to write more and more of it. And then when I became established as a novelist, and I became a full-time novelist, I started to write a bit more, and I started to collaborate with musicians, which actually was a very good way of doing it. I became a collaborator of an Edinburgh composer, Tom Cunningham, with whom I've worked on, heaven knows, 15 pieces or something of that sort. We did an opera together. I've done various little operettas with him, and I've worked with other composers. I'm currently, I've written a libretto for for Thomas Hyde, who's a composer based in London. I've done other works with Tom Hyde and with other composers. So the poetry sort of fed into that, and I published poetry in various places, and then did this complete collection.
And what's the difference for you from writing prose to poetry? You know, what's the different need? Do you see what I mean? You know, when does your mind want to go, well, I think this is a story and this is a novel or whatever, or, you know, you've written children's stories as well. And when does it want to go to, no, I think this is a poem? What's that for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that I regard poetry as the distillation of feeling about something. I think that's the essence of poetry, that it is a distillation. You're boiling the impression, the thought, the emotion down into poetic form. It must be quite intense. So that probably that occurs at odd moments when I think about something and feel that there's a particular sentiment I wish to express, but it's not a sentiment which needs the vehicle of a short story or novel to be expressed. I find that the distinction between prose and poetry can be a sort of rather flexible one, can be a slightly grey one, in that I think that you can you can make prose sound quite poetic, and indeed a lot of prose you can actually render as poetry. It's the two aren't quite as separate as we sometimes think they are.
Prose can have its own rhythm, for instance, can't
yes.
it?
Oh, it can. And I think that, I mean, I feel that when I write, I'm very conscious of the balance of sentences. Cadences can be very important in prose, just as they are obviously in poetry. So I pay attention to cadences and to scansion, in a sense, in poetry. When I write prose, I do hear a rhythm in my mind, which is not all that dissimilar to the rhythm, to the beat that I hear when I'm writing poetry.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, that even a line of prose can have a sort of musicality to it, and a sort of arc to it that you're listening in for as much as anything else. But let's hear another poem before we say any more. I wanted to get you to read your poem "Household Gods," and I want to jump off from that. But
okay, "Household Gods." This poem I wrote in response to, I suppose, to the idea of household gods. I've got a book in my library here about household gods in the Greek and Roman world, and people had these little household gods in their kitchens or the entrance hall of their houses, and of course you can see them. They're lovely little things, and of course household gods also are important in certain traditions. I've got several boxes of lovely little Hindu household gods, which I've acquired, beautifully painted figures, and the idea of having some little god figure in one's house, drawing one's attention to a value or a life or something of that sort, is an attractive one. And this poem addresses that. It's a light poem. It's I suppose one could say a humorous poem. Household Gods. Household gods, though you are asked too frequently to perform the task of blessing, I still would plead, in charity you'll intercede on our behalf. Grant private wishes, optimistic and auspicious. Bless eggs, omelettes, and potatoes, the gatherers of herbs and cultivators. Bless morning brightness and the night, the darkness and the warming light, the gentle winds, the patient land, the mountains and the desert sound. Bless those I love and those who may listen to what I have to say. Bless those who in each other's arms find haven from all ill and harm. Dear household gods, I've not got through the list of things that you should do. But remember me, if you can, and explain the ways of gods to man. I at least will then believe how it is you can relieve the pain we feel in our being, our simple selves, while you, all-knowing, will help us in our daily growing. We turn to you as to a friend and light a candle to that end.
Thank you. That's lovely. Thank you. From that poem, I wanted to, and just generally, I wanted to talk to you. This sounds a bit grand, but I wanted to talk to you about your moral sense. I was really struck reading Number One Ladies Detective Agency. This striking mixture between, what would you call it? I think I've written down here, a sort of innocence and basic human goodness. Right the way next to sort of cruelty and depravity and horror, really. But I felt from the novels that your worldview is one that human goodness is core, and I see that moral sense. I saw that moral sense in the novels. I've also seen it very much in the poems. I see it in your book on Auden. I wonder whether you might say something about your sort of moral sense. What that's come to mean to you, because it's a theme throughout your whole work, more or less overt, I thought.
Yes, I think, I suppose I don't necessarily, I never sat down as an author with a particular agenda saying I'm going to write from a particular perspective or make a particular point. So I wouldn't wish to be too didactic in my approach. I think that all of us obviously have a moral sense within us, in that we have a sense of what is right, and I suppose part of life's drama for most of us is dealing with that, and how are we to respond to that? And of course, most of us, myself included, we don't meet the standards that we perhaps should meet. So we're all imperfect, and we all, nonetheless, I think, can see goodness when we bump up against it, and I think we can be very inspired by that. It can help us in our way through life, and I think at heart most of us want to lead a good life. I think that's something which is pretty essential to us. We want to be loved. We want to lead a good life. We want fulfillment of some sort, and the problem is that we often don't realize how we're making that difficult for ourselves or for other people. So I would just say that I'm a fan of. I suppose I'm a fan of a certain innocence. Yes. I like it when I see it. I don't like cynicism. Cynicism is very unattractive. So I rather like. I like it when I encounter innocence and integrity in other people. When you see that, and so and I think that. I think the question really, as a writer, the issue for me is how do you describe that without making everything rather dull in a way? I think it's very easy to describe vice in a broad sense. You can describe the wickedness of the world. It doesn't take much imagination to do that. Just really describe what we see all about us. So all of that is happening. It is, I think, it's a little bit harder to describe goodness in people, but you can do it, and I think it's worth doing. So, for example, the number one ladies detective agency books are all about this woman, Maitreyabandhu, Precious Ramotswe, who actually is a very good woman.
Yes,
she's a wonderful woman, yes, and she's not in the slightest bit dull. She's great fun, but she represents something which I've seen myself in when I lived and worked in Botswana. I met people like that. I really encounter, and it's something which there are qualities which often rather surprised visitors to that country who went there not quite knowing what to expect, but actually come across this and are struck by kindness, decency, all of these values which you actually can encounter. You can encounter them in any country, but it's quite interesting in Botswana, which I think is a very good country. They're quite evident. I remember often I've talked to people when I've been on tour in the United States, for example, meeting many people who had read the books and had visited Botswana because they'd read about Maitreyabandhu. And I'd say to them, well, what was your impression? How did it go? And they'll often say, they were so kind to us. They're struck by the kindness. And I say, well, there we are. Now, the problem is that we're so used to the portrayal of the various pathologies of our world. We're so used to the portrayal of cruelty and violence and confrontation that we've almost come to expect that as being the default values in any entertainment or narrative or story. And that worries me, because I think that there's another side to life, which is the portrayal of people leading good, productive lives. Sometimes people will condescend to you if you're writing about those virtues. You'll be slightly condescended to by people who feel that that's not the role of literature. That literature should somehow be concerned with pathologies.
Yes, and yet your novels aren't shy of those. There's no sort of, I didn't get any sense of sort of pretending those away.
No.
But I really like I really valued and admired that sort of, well, almost affirmation that, that's not the central matter of being human.
No, that's right. I mean, most people's lives are good and productive lives. I mean, most people's life doesn't consist of confrontation and violence and all of those things. And most people's lives are fairly straightforward. And
yeah, indeed. I mean, that bring me on to the poems as well, because you talk of Auden. We'll come to Auden in a moment, being a Horatian Horatian poet, and his concern with the personal moral life. So, do you think of yourself as a Horatian poet?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't claim anything for my own work. I think that I so admire Auden. I admire the many poets whose work I admire. Auden leads them all, in my view. But I do like Horatian poetry, in a sense. That little poem that I read, The Household Gods, in a sense, is a bit of a homage, perhaps, to Horace himself, in that I remember when I was learning Latin as a callow youth, I read Ode's book 3,
Oh,
and
yeah, yeah.
was obliged to read it. And when I first went to Horace, any teenage boy is going to say, "Oh, what's this all about? You know, what's he going on about?" And then you realise just how I suppose how consoling Horatian poetry is. It's the cultivation of the individual garden. It's with its contemplation of the immediate, and in fact, it's very much in tune with contemporary notions of mindfulness.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah,
And with place. So let's hear another poem. I don't want to go too far away from the poems themselves. So let's hear Adventures and Uncertainties. You've written a selection. There's a little sequence of sonnets in the middle of the book, and let's hear this sonnet. But perhaps say a little bit about the sonnet form.
Yes, I rather like the sonnet. I'm a great fan of Shakespeare's sonnets. I think Shakespeare's sonnets repay constant recitation and reading. I mean, most of them. Some of them are not so good. I mean, I'm sure Shakespeare himself would have said, "Well, I haven't done very well with that one," and did rather. But they're very beautiful. They really are extraordinary. Interestingly enough, when I first read Shakespeare's sonnets a long time ago, I felt I was sort of wandering around in them and not really appreciating them. Then I started to look at them in a more serious fashion, and took a great deal from them. So I do like the sonnet as a form, because it's a nice little reflection, and it's got that little change of tone it should have. I mean, you've got various options with sonnets. You've got various rhyming schemes that you can use and so on. But they end up with an observation on the world. This is one called Adventure and Uncertainty. Embarking on a journey without maps, against the current or on a troubled sea, reminds us, if we need it, to be free involves that tricky word that is perhaps. Perhaps it's better to remain just where you started from, yes, an undistinguished place. But going nowhere, after all, is no disgrace. You know at least just who and what is there. Few people like the view that they're too small to lead the hero's life. That lengthy trail Odysseus bravely followed cannot fail to inspire those who've never lived at all. But courting danger, we might all agree, is not the only way of being free. So, not sure what that means, but nonetheless.
What that takes me to is this another strong theme I see in your work, Alexander, which is this sense of the importance of belonging.
Yeah.
In your collection, very much it's a belonging in Scotland, but of course, the number one ladies detective agency series, there's a deep sense of belonging in Botswana. I wonder whether you say something about that sense of belonging for you.
Well, I think it's terribly important. I think that we all need to belong to something and to some place, to people, place in particular. So we need to belong to a community, and we need to belong to, probably also we need to belong to a tradition. We need to know where we are, because the world is a pretty sort of, I suppose, worrying place in many respects. We're tiny little creatures on a lump of rock, circling around in space. And once you start to look at where we are in astronomical terms, our insignificance is pretty acute. We're definitely we seem very insignificant. So in this world, we need to be attached to something. This is very fundamental part of our nature. We need to be attached. We need to have certain anchors. we need to be able to look back and see where we came from in our personal history, and otherwise we are alone, very, very alone, and vulnerable. We're also at risk, because if we don't have a sense of belonging to a community, we're unprotected from adversity. And if you belong to a community, you've got the support of the community, and so on. Our modern world is this globalization has actually brought many benefits economically to the poorer people, in that undoubtedly what has happened, that people who were previously living on very little have had their living standards raised, which is wonderful and very important. But it has also had the effect of rather removing those who control us from our immediate environment. So people have felt that power is being exercised in distant places by people who are not answerable to them, and so that leads to a sense of alienation, anomie, and so on. And I think a lot of people have felt that, and of course that has dangers, because when people feel that, they may turn to false gods, so to speak, and they may think that they may be ripe for plucking by people who pursue aggressive programs, nationalistic programs, seeing other people as the enemy, so on. So very quickly people can be diverted into very unpleasant waters with that. So we do need to recognise this sense of attachment to the local and the importance of the local, and we need to preserve the local in people's lives and their sense of control of their life, without, I suppose, making it impossible for broader visions to be pursued. So if we look at the world, we'll say that there are various sort of pressures working in conflicting directions. There's on the one hand, there are those pressures which are saying, okay, big government and supranational government, cooperation at the international level, taking away powers from local entities of various sort, because we need to have that sort of exercise of power to deal with these universal problems, that sort of thing. So that's working in one direction. The other direction is people saying, but we actually want to feel that we are masters of our own fate, that we want to feel that the people who take decisions about our lives are answerable to us, a democratic desire. So these are terrific pressures. And I think the idea of the local and the local gives people a very strong sense of value, of their own value. If you're a member of a small group, you may feel appreciated. If you don't have that, then you may say, well, what's my role? I mean, if you think of what has happened to many young men in particular in this country, they've lost their traditional roles because of changes in the workplace. So they're not working with other young men. They may feel quite worthless because they don't have the camaraderie of the workplace. They don't have a sense that their skills, that their labour is appreciated. and that can happen. People can be regarded as disposable
Yes.
in those circumstances, and there is a crisis, I think, about self-image and sense of self-worth in particularly young males. I think it's acknowledged this is a bit of an issue.
Yeah, indeed. And one that's easy to sort of, I don't know, strangely overlook at the moment.
Yes, yeah.
I want to go on to that reminds me what you're saying there about the local, and I think there's a lot to think about the local, isn't it? And that's a vital matter, and it reminds me of Auden talking about a poem needs to be like a valley cheese or something made somewhere, appreciated everywhere, something like that.
Yeah.
And I thought that might take us on to Auden, because you write about his nightmare of a sense of absence of belonging. That's sort of my connection. But yeah, I wanted to talk about Auden. I was particularly struck by this section here where you say, let me find it. You say, when Auden decided that science and psychology, along with the liberal humanistic values they proclaimed, were powerless in the face of evil, real evil, he chose to commit himself to a system of belief that gave grounds for the pursuit of the good.
Mm-hmm.
I was very struck by that. You're in this wonderful short book, beautiful short book. You really are trying to say how Auden can help you, what he can do for you. And one of your points there is that he can steer us towards a spiritual life.
Yes.
And I wanted, first of all, just because one of the things that struck me is his embracing of Christianity.
Yeah.
And why did he do that?
Yeah.
And I was very struck by that.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I feel that Auden has so much to say to us today that he hasn't really dated very much, is because he spent a very important part of his life in times of crisis, and I think that we're faced with a crisis of a fairly similar nature at the moment, and one has to be careful about comparing historical periods, but I think that we do have that. And Auden, when Auden was a young man, he believed he was very interested in science. He loved, as you know, he loved old machines and lead workings and things of that sort. So he'd been brought up to appreciate science and mechanics in a way. Although he was, I think, pretty impractical. Apparently he was a really bad driver, for example, things like that. So Auden, when he, in his earlier days, he was a great, in the 1930s, he was a poet of the left. Many people of his generation were understandably pretty horrified by what they saw in Europe with the rise of fascism in Germany and in Spain. And of course, a number of them went off and fought in the Spanish Civil War. It was a defining moment for them. And Auden felt initially that psychology and science would contain the answers to our problems. That if you understood the human psyche in psychological terms, then you could deal with evil, human evil. And of course, he wrote a wonderful poem, one of his greatest poems, in my view, In Memoriam of Sigmund Freud,
Yes,
in which he talks about the liberating effect of psychoanalytical theory and how it would release people from these demons. Then there was apparently a particular instant where Auden really was brought up against something very horrifying. He was in a cinema in New York, in an area where there were a lot of people of German extraction or German-speaking people, and there was a newsreel of the German troops invading and sweeping all away in sort of blitzkrieg. And the chairing of the audience was so shocking there that this sort of human aggression was being chaired, that I think he experienced a moment when he realized that science, psychology and science weren't going to be able to deal with this. And I'm sure that his return to his Christian faith was more complex than that. And he became very interested in theology, and in fact he wrote poems about theology. He also wrote poems about limestone and things like that. But he did tackle these theological issues, and I think he just felt that probably was the only answer to this. And you can see how people can feel that if you pin all your hopes on reason as reason is embodied in science and psychology generally, and then you think, well, that's not going to do it. It's not going to be able to do it. So that, and there are all sorts of issues that follow from that. I've just been writing volume 15 of my Isabel Dalhousie books, and I have Isabel thinking about one of these issues where she and her husband are wondering how they're going to answer their young son's questions about God, as to whether they should tell him they themselves are uncertain in their own personal theology, whether they should how they should answer these questions, whether they should give him any structure of beliefs, or whether they should wait and let him make a decision about those down the line later on. And Isabel thinks about this and thinks about how communion of belief in whatever it is, whatever we're talking about, whether it's belief in the healing power of music, or belief in a religious system or a philosophical system, any sort of community of belief makes it possible for people to do things, to accomplish things. And I then, in this little passage in the Isabel book, go on to talk about somebody whom I've not met, but whose work I follow, who's a member of an Anglican order, who spends all his time trying to help vulnerable and needy young people in an African country. That's what he does. Right. And Isabel says, yes, would people do that if they weren't inspired by a system of belief? In theory, people would do it, but would they in practice do it if they didn't have that sense of being joined with other people in this mutual enterprise and the sense of the importance? So it's something we need to think about, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, that made me wonder, I don't know, this is slightly a personal question, but where does that take you somewhere in terms of faith? That.
Well, it not really, because I think that what it does mean is that I will address these issues in the books or in the writing. I do these without necessarily committing myself in the books. So, for example, with Isabel, we have Isabel looking at these philosophical issues, and a character may encounter a sort of issue. I'm sympathetic, very sympathetic to people who put great store in a religious or philosophical system, and I'm also sympathetic to the notion of a spiritual existence. what I probably don't spend much time on thinking about, or certainly discussing a great deal, is which particular interpretation of things I would personally favour, and I may have difficulty in believing certain claims that are made. Many claims I would say, well, I can't sign up to those because I don't see those as being likely. But at the same time, I can say, well, as long as those claims lead to a benevolent view of the world, and as long as they provide for the spiritual needs of people, and we do have spiritual needs. Now, those spiritual needs can be fulfilled by music, for example, as much as by meditation or
Yes,
religious
indeed.
observance. All of that is part of the spiritual life.
And by spiritual, what would you mean by that? The sort of the deeper needs of the deeper human needs?
Well, I think it's spiritual needs are, I suppose, needs of this. We end up with the language of the soul.
Yes.
Spiritual needs are the needs of the soul. Now, I rather like the word soul. Contemporary philosophy would tend to use the term self, and so philosophers, contemporary philosophers, discuss sources of the self, the how we define ourselves, how the self is created, and so on. But I think that there is something within us which we can equally well call the soul, and the soul, in a sense, is addressing something rather different from what the philosophical self discussion addresses. We do. I love the expression in marine in the past, and even today you can when talking on the radio in a maritime context. I'm a keen sailor, and I have my license to operate. I've got my marine radio license, operator's license, and
You're full of surprises.
and you know, when you talk about, traditionally when you talked about how many people are on board, so if you're sending out your Mayday signal, you'll say you could say 4 souls on board. And I think that used to be used quite extensively, that there were 15 souls on. Now, that's really significant, because the term soul says you are more than a mere physical entity.
Yes, that's
You are
right.
something significant, something that we value. So it goes right to the heart of our philosophical evaluation of human life.
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting because, you know, in Buddhism, as you may or may know, there's lots of discussion about, you know, the self and whether the self exists, and which, frankly, I can get a bit tired of. But I think the soul is I feel it's a very strong metaphor for this sense of, as you say, that there's something about you that you have to call the human that isn't just to do with what you want and what you get and who you like, but so it's a metaphor for the deeper sense of ourselves in the world.
Exactly. And I mean, it takes us deep into these very fundamental issues of our existence.
So
I do, by the way, I do like the idea. I'm very sympathetic to Buddhist skepticism or questioning of self, because self, in one sense, can get in the way so much.
Yes, that's right.
Of that spiritual life.
Yes.
You know,
Well, you'll know that from writing, won't you? That the person who writes a poem or writes a novel isn't the person who sits down with a cup of tea and turns on their computer.
Yeah.
We used to talk about the muse, didn't we? And I think there's something in that.
Yeah.
You're wanting to make your own effort, and you're wanting something to step into that effort.
Yeah.
That's sort of more than you, but not separate from you. That's how I see it anyway. But it can feel quite striking, can't it, when you write or when you listen to music? It's as if some deeper or almost external force steps in.
Yes. Yes. And I think most people have some experience of that. I mean, some people don't lead particularly spiritually attuned lives, and they may be very materialistic. They may not think about these things very, very much, but most people will have their moments when they're suddenly aware of something of that nature, and it may be when they contemplate beauty.
Yes,
beauty, right. Ideas of beauty are all, and harmony are all tied up in that. And then I suppose for most people, music is very important. They're getting that through music. Their sense of beauty and harmony is involved in their listening to their music.
Yes, that's right. It's very striking that you should mention beauty, because it reminds me of Marilyn Robinson's novels and her thinking. That she's a Calvinist writer, but she said that beauty is a conversation between mankind or humankind and reality. That it's often in the experience of beauty, whether it's listening to music or that lock that you'll be writing next to after New Year, that you feel that there's something more to life.
Yes, exactly.
You can never pin that down, and you don't want to pin that down.
That's right. So if you listen to a gorgeously elevating piece of music, I find, for example, whenever I listen to Mozart's trio from from Così fan tutte, Salve Sil Vento, that's the most beautiful piece of music, absolutely exquisite piece of music, with wonderful lines as well. May your journey through life be a gentle one. May the winds that take you on your journey be gentle. Well, marvellous. Now, you can't but be moved by that. You can't but be moved by things when you see beauty in operation in the world. When you see an act of kindness, I mean, that can bring tears to the eyes. I get teary-eyed when I see somebody doing something really kind for another person.
Yes,
I'm very, very struck by that. What's happening there? It's somehow we're seeing that force in operation, that thing that we may find very difficult to define, but we're seeing it there, and we are. And in a sense, it gives meaning. We respond to it. It's right. We just think this is right.
Yes, that's right, and it's right. It's almost all you can say about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I want to make sure we come back to the poems again. I don't want to get us too far away from. So I thought I'd ask you to read it on the bedside table.
Yes.
And then say something about your reading, and then perhaps we might have one more. But
yes, certainly. This is a poem of a shortish series of poems that I wrote about books on the bedside table. Pray that in our later years, on our bedside table, there will be more books than jars of pills. Pray that when we dim the light, it is on a world of complex plots rather than one of rancour. Pray that we will still believe it important that the heroine should still marry the hero. Pray that to our children we shall still give those books we ourselves loved when young. That the dish should still run away with the spoon in an unwise elopement. That the Velveteen Rabbit will never be made less tragic by prescription antibiotics. That pirates will still walk the plank rather than be given the benefit of the doubt. That at the end of the day, Scout and Gem will still be read to by Atticus Finch, that mice and men and great white whales will frolic in their elements. Pray for all of that, and for that device, the book, our beloved companion and our friend. So that's a little poem really about books in our lives, the importance of books in our lives, with various references to various specific books there. Children's stories, the Velveteen Rabbit, Scout and Gem from To Kill a Mockingbird being read to by Atticus Finch. In other words, it's a slightly nostalgic invocation of the comfort of books, because books provide great comfort.
And what it reminded me of is, again, in the Auden book, you were saying it's easier to assert meaninglessness than it is to assert meaning. And one of the things you seem to be doing in your work, Alexander, is to try to assert meaning, and even meaning in the everyday. Because we live in the everyday, don't we? We're not in a soap opera where every other day we have an affair or shoot the next door neighbour. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, sometimes I think we might get the impression we're in a soap opera.
Right, yes.
that we're all in one big soap opera. And, that can be rather fun, actually. I'm a great fan of soap operas. I think that, nothing wrong with a good soap opera. But I think that, but your serious point there about meaning in the small things, I think that actually the very small issues are terribly, terribly important. And the small issues that we read about in books, that we may encounter in books, may actually say a great deal about human life. Jane Austen made the point about her books were little paintings on ivory, little squares of ivory, on which she put a few brush strokes. And she was absolutely right. If you look at Jane Austen, I mean, what's Jane Austen about? It's whether Mr. So-and-so will marry Miss So-and-so, really, effectively, or who's going for tea with whom, that sort of stuff. And yet, we feel that there's a great deal being said in those little stories. Similarly, if you look at, I'm a great fan of Benson's Map and Lucia novels, which are so wonderfully funny. And the pettiness of Map and Lucia and Georgie Pilson and all those characters there, they're arguing about tiny little things, but that says a great deal about human nature and about the human tendency to. So these small things, the little things in our life, are very important, very, very important. And I think books often can express that. In the Number One Ladies Detective Agency, Mama Coetzee has at the beginning of the books, she's got a little lace handkerchief, which is threadbare. But that handkerchief is of tremendous significance for her because it represents beauty and the beautiful things that her life of poverty hasn't really allowed her before that point. So in these small things, I think you can deal with major issues. People's arguments about whether somebody's used their teacup or something of that sort without permission. Really, you can extrapolate from those to talk about the condition of the world and the major disputes.
Yes, indeed you can. Yes, but let's come back to. I'm struck that we're talking. At least we're premiering this on Christmas Eve, and so it felt really right to finish your poems at least. We'll finish with a little bit of Auden as well. I thought it'd be lovely to hear your section on winter from your Scottish Four Seasons.
Yes, certainly, yes. Let's have that. This is, as you say, a poem about, the four seasons in Scotland, and winter. That there should be winter, that the hard light should fall over a December Scotland, should make the sea grey like steel, and the land itself a rock rising from metalled water. That there should be empty skies, free of protecting cloud, too cold even for that. that there should be a vapour trail of some great jet heading west to the colder shores of Greenland, Labrador, northern neighbours to us, distant cousins in our marginality and our pursuit of fish. That all this should be in a land that in summer is so soft and wet, with drifting veils of rain, and filled with deer and clouds of midges, and the rich fecundity of ploughed fields that will yield gold barley and whisky beyond the barley. Scotland is a country of attenuated light, and temperate to inhospitable seasons. Freshness and cold skies lie behind all our signs, our way of being. I sometimes wish, I confess, for a life spent in the scent of wild thyme and olive trees, for evenings when one might stroll slowly about a square and watch pigeons launch themselves into Italian air from some tower dreamed up by some high Renaissance imagination. That, though, is not where we are from, or where we are destined to be. Our place is north, our natural gravity, that of a land that is an afterthought to Europe, a land that comes late to so many of the parties it's been invited to, but which we love with all our heart, with all our heart. Winter doesn't make us better then or worse, but enables us to find ourselves again, because it forces us to be quiet, obliges us to listen to the coursing of our own blood. Winter reminds us that warmth is not something we find naturally, some gift of munificent nature, but must be made, that we should make in Scotland, a small place of warmth, a small country of kindness to others, of brotherhood, is what our poets have been striving to say since they first gave voice to song, that we might find this in winter, in a troubled world, is a local miracle to warm the heart, to warm the heart.
Thank you. That brings us full circle, doesn't it, to that, what you said at the start about the quiet time of year.
Yes,
and New Year being a time after that frenetic December, where for a period of reflection and so on. Really lovely to come back to that. I thought I'd like to then just finish a little bit with Auden, because one of the things you say in your book on Auden, you say that if you read Auden deeply enough, and as you have, and you've read Auden very deeply, you said that that the reader will be changed in a subtle but significant way, and that you said you'd been changed in a subtle but significant way. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit about how you've been changed by, well, not just Auden, but by your own reading, and how you think that writing, whether it's a novel and indeed poetry, how that can, whether it's Auden's poetry or anything else, how that can sort of subtly but significantly change us.
Yes, I think it can do that, because when you read poetry, you are engaged in a conversation with a poet who has written the lines, and in any conversation, in any encounter with another person, we are potentially changed. So we can spend time with another mind, and that other mind may be a mind of great subtlety and sympathy. And that's what I feel about Auden, that there's a voice there. When I read Auden, I feel that he's talking to me. And that, of course, is part of his poetic greatness, that there is a conversational style that he has. Now, we should feel that, I think, with many poets, as long as the poet is being sincere, as long as there isn't too much of the poet's self getting in the way, that we aren't, that there's no posturing. We are having a conversation with somebody who says, please listen to what I feel about something. And that, of course, is potentially changing. If you have that sort of conversation with people, you're going to become, you're going to gain a great deal of their insights and their feelings. So with Auden, I feel that very strongly. It's a great humane voice.
Yes,
and I think that's that's the thing about reading great literature, is that it invites us to address moral issues, personal issues. It says, stop, look at this, think about this, and it's part of our human journey, our moral journey of discovery of the world and discovery of ourselves. So it's enriching. Literature is just so enriching. Potentially, I mean, not all. I mean, you can read things which are just distracting, for which there's a role. I mean, we all want to be distracted from time to time. With good reason. But when you read, I felt this so strongly about Auden. I've always felt that this is this wonderful humane voice getting me to look at the world in a slightly different way. And there are other poets who do it. I think any half decent poet will have that effect when you read. But Auden addressed so many subjects. I mean, he was so broad in his interests. I mean, I referred earlier on to his poem on limestone. I mean, there's a poet who writes about the qualities of a particular sort of rock, which I think, and then on the other hand, you'll find him writing about theological issues or psychoanalytical issues, or so very, very, very broad.
He's just good company, isn't he?
He's very good. He's very good company, and I must say that I try and persuade people if I meet people who haven't read Auden. I always say, please go and give him a try, and people often are very struck by. Remember that film, Four Weddings and a Funeral?
Yes.
The Auden poem at the funeral.
Yes.
Now, I know Edward Mendelsohn, who's Auden's literary executor, and Auden really had the very good idea of appointing a young man as his literary executor. When he appointed Edward was doing postgraduate research at Yale, I think, on Auden. Auden was so impressed to discover this young man who knew everything that he'd written and where it was, that he appointed him his literary executor, because people often appoint their contemporaries as literary executors, and then, of course, when they fall off the perch, the literary executor falls off the perch as well. So, but Edward's had a wonderful run of it, and he's been able to spend many decades working on Auden's work and developing a wonderful body of criticism, and making sure that all the poems and essays and plays and so on are all edited and published properly. So he's been a great, and he's become a very good friend of mine. And he told me that suddenly his telephone started to ring after Four Weddings and a Funeral was shown. He couldn't work out why the phone was going all the time. And this was because people had heard Funeral Blues in the film.
It's a knockout poem, isn't it?
It's a knockout poem. Absolutely wonderful poem. It really is. It's just, but for many people that was their first exposure to Auden, and they were just, it really impressed them, and so all sorts of people were wanting to reproduce it, and
yes, that's right.
And so on. Similarly, just one little other aspect about the impact of the work. After the Twin Towers attack in the United States, people in New York were feeling very raw, and they started to fax one another copies of his poem September the 1st, 1939.
Yes, that's right.
And it went from hand to hand.
Yes.
It gave them great comfort, and that's extraordinary. A poem written many years earlier had this sudden comforting life for people who were very traumatized.
But let's hear a little bit of Auden, because you in your short book on Auden, you talk about a New Year's letter. You know, we're moving up to New Year. Actually, it's a poem that I've skipped for, strangely. I don't know it, so you pointed me back to it. But you quote a few lines from that poem in your book. I thought it would be lovely just to hear a little bit of Auden.
Yes, indeed. New Year's letter, fairly close to the beginning of the poem. Here's some lines from that. We fall down in the dance, we make the old ridiculous mistake, but always there are such as you, forgiving, helping what we do. Oh, every day in sleep and labour, our life and death are with our neighbour. And love illuminates again the city and the lion's den, the world's great rage, the travel of young men. It's really, I mean, that's pretty classic Auden, and we've got a lot there. He used every sort of metre, as you know, and he was very, very versatile. So we've got that's sort of fairly. That's very carefully calculated. He's got a rhyming scheme there, and so on. But he also puts in wonderful, challenging thoughts, or very, very thought-provoking lines into a poem. And so, for example, "Oh, every day in sleep and labour, our life and death are with our neighbour." That's a very, very
again, asserting that communal life,
exactly
connected life.
And indeed, in the September the 1st, 1939 poem, there are a couple of lines there that are similarly powerful. Trying to remember where he says, "Those that the lesson that I and all school children learn, those to whom evil is done do evil in return."
Yes, that's right.
Wow,
wonderfully memorable.
Utterly memorable. We've also got curious images that Auden went in for, odd images there. And love illuminates again. That's fine. The city, yes, and the lion's den. And the lion's den is unexpected there. Every so often in Auden, we see a reference to lions. Lions crop up.
Yes, they do, don't they?
I don't know whether Auden ever saw a lion, but we do have lions in his poem. If I could tell you, he mentions that.
That's right.
Lions get up and go away. You know, what are the lions doing in that poem?
Yes.
The city and the lion's den. I suppose that's a juxtaposition of two contrasting. The city represents civilization and human, and the lion's den represents danger. And I think the lion's den is doing a bit of work there. It's not arbitrary, but
and the biblical reference somewhere. I don't know.
I think we've probably got, Daniel might be coming in.
He's in the wing somewhere.
So and that occurs throughout his work. That lovely little poem about if mutual, where he talks about. What is it?
Mutual affection cannot be. Let the more loving one be me.
Yes. That really that sums it up, doesn't it?
It really does.
That could be an entire philosophy of life.
Yes,
the world
indeed.
Isn't necessarily going to love us as we would like the world to love us, and we accept that. But in spite of that, we're going to make the effort to love the world. That's it's a fine response to that terrible problem of unequal affection or unreciprocated, which I, as a novelist, find very interesting. I find unreciprocated love is a great theme in literature. It's poignant, and Auden has the solution to it. Well, you in spite of that, you still express love for the world.
And that's a really wonderful place to finish, Alexander, because I think it's almost like that's a sort of philosophy for your life, that you've tried to be the more loving one. If equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me. It feels like that's like a mantra. Here I am at the Buddhist Center. That could be a mantra. Equal affection cannot be, let the more loving one be me.
Yes, yeah.
So thank you very much, Alexander, not just for being our guest here at PoetryEast, but for all the novels, for the children's books, for the libretto, for the poetry, for your wonderful short book on Auden. It's a really wonderful way of meeting Auden for the first time if you've not read Auden, and a wonderful way of remembering so much if you have.
Well, thank you.
Yes, really lovely to meet you, Alexander. Really, really lovely. So thank you for coming. I hope you have a good Christmas. We're coming up to Christmas, and I hope your quiet time after Christmas brings much good and much depth and much reflection.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So do tune in to our next PoetryEast. So coming up on PoetryEast, we've got the Irish novelist Colm Tóibín. We've got the American poet Tracy K. Smith. We've got Sir Christopher Lebrun, who is a wonderful artist. And we've got many, many more. So underneath this video, you'll see a link in which you can join our mailing list. It's the easiest way for us to send these films to you. So do join our mailing list, and you'll hear more of these wonderful conversations such as the one we've just had. Thanks very much, everybody. Hope you tune in again.